Our master of ceremonies is one of our most popular speakers, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Eagleman, a neuroscientist from Baylor College of Medicine. Since he's been speaking here for a couple years, a Guggenheim Fellow, a best-selling New York Times author both in fiction and nonfiction. Will you please help welcome Dr. David Eagleman. David.
Thank you. So as far as we can tell, we're the only species on the planet that's grown so sophisticated that we've thrown ourselves headlong into this game of trying to figure out our own programming language. So it would be as though your computer started controlling its own peripheral devices and lifted its own computer cover off and pointed its webcam at its own circuitry, tried to figure out what it was made of. That's the situation that we're in. And what we found under the hood is the most complicated device that we've ever found in the universe. So the human brain weighs about 3 pounds. It contains tens of billions of neurons. Neurons are the specialized cell types of the brain. Each neuron is as complicated as Kleinberg's Houston. Each neuron contains the entire human genome, and it's trafficking around millions of proteins. And each one of these neurons is connected to about 10,000 of its neighbors. So that means we're talking about hundreds of trillions of connections between neurons. It's such a complexity that it bankrupts the English language. We don't even have a way of talking about this. We have to invent new strains of mathematics. And if you were to take a cubic centimeter of brain tissue, there are more connections in there than there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So it's a very complicated system. Now, the most interesting part is that somehow this system is you. All your hopes, your dreams, your aspirations, all your feelings, your memories, all of that is contained in this giant, vast, electrochemical, wet network. And the reason we know that is because if you were to damage some part of your body, like your little toe, in a car accident, you'd be sad about that, but you wouldn't be any different as a person. But if you were to damage an equivalently sized chunk of neural tissue, that can change you entirely. That can change your decision-making, your risk aversion, your capacity to understand music or simulate possible futures and evaluate them, or see colors or name animals. These are all the sorts of things that can change when your brain tissue changes, and this is how we know that somehow you are your brain. Now, the most amazing part to me about this whole system, as I've been studying it over my professional career, is the fact that essentially everything happening in this giant system is running under the hood of conscious awareness. So when you do something like when I lift this bottle of water to my mouth, that's actually underpinned by a lightning storm of neural activity. There is a lot going on there. And if any of you have ever played around with robotics, you know that getting the grip force right and the elbow and the wrist joint and everything, that's really difficult, right? But I'm not aware of any of that. And in fact, if it weren't for neurobiology, you would have no reason to suspect the existence of electrical signals and neurons and tendons and muscles, right? It's all completely invisible to you. And what I realized at some point is, it's not just lifting a bottle, it's everything that you do. It's driving a car. It's recognizing a friend's face, falling in love. All of these things are happening under the hood of conscious awareness, down at this level, and you don't know what's happening down there. And this is the notion of the unconscious. And it turns out that the conscious mind, the part that flickers to life when you wake up in the morning, that's the smallest bit of what's happening in your brain. It's like the broom closet in the mansion of the brain. So think about when you have an idea and you say, oh, I just thought of something. It wasn't actually you that thought of it. Your brain's been working on that behind the scenes for hours or days. And at some point, it's evaluated things and baked them and it serves it up. And you say, oh, I'm a genius. But it wasn't really you, right? So essentially, the conscious mind is this little bit, it's like a stowaway on a transatlantic steamship that's taking credit for the whole journey without acknowledging the massive engineering underfoot. So as Carl Jung said, in each of us there is another whom we do not know. Or as Pink Floyd put it, there's someone in my head, but it's not me. So I'll give you an example of this. There was a study a few years ago where men were asked to rate the attractiveness of women's faces in photographs. So they ranked from 1 to 10 how attractive they thought each woman was. What the men didn't know is that in half of the photographs, the women's eyes had been dilated with some eye drops. Well, it turns out that uniformly, the men were more attracted to the women with the dilated eyes. Now, the thing is, none of the men said, oh, I noticed her pupil was a millimeter larger over here. None of them noticed that. And presumably, none of the men knew that dilated eyes is a biological sign of sexual readiness in women. But their brains knew. Whoomp, and they went over here. And they felt more attracted, but they didn't know why. Well, the why is they were running deep evolutionary programs that were baked into the circuitry that they weren't even aware of, but they were driving their behavior appropriately. Now, it turns out there are lots of unconscious influences like this on our lives. So, for example, if your name is Dennis or Denise, you are statistically more likely to become a dentist. Now, this is based on something that psychologists call implicit egotism. We like things that sound like our own names. You know, we like people who share our birthdays, for example, even though it's completely arbitrary. We like them better, things like that. But it turns out this is it's a small effect, but it's statistically verifiable. If you go through the professional registries of dentists, you'll find out there's an overrepresentation of this type. Okay, this is a terrible reason to choose a profession, right? And if you were to ask any of these Dennises or Denises why they became a dentist, their conscious narrative probably wouldn't include this part. They would say, well, I like teeth, it's a good profession. So they'd have a whole story for it, but it doesn't actually represent what we can pull out with the statistics. I'll give you another example of that. It turns out, statistically, you are more likely to marry somebody whose first name begins with the same first letter as your first name. So Joe and Jennifer, Donnie and Daisy, Alex and Amy, all of these things. You can go through the marriage registries in any county and prove to yourself that statistically this is more likely to happen. Well, that's a terrible reason to choose a life mate, right? And if you ask them their reasons for it, they're going to have some sort of conscious narrative, but it's missing some of what's happening under the hood. It also influences how we feel about things. So it turns out if you're holding a warm mug of coffee, you will describe your relationship with your mother as closer than if you're holding iced coffee. There are unconscious influences on essentially everything we do, all the decisions we make, and so there's this major gap between what your mind knows and what your brain knows, what's happening under the hood there. So why is there this gap? Well, it turns out you want this gap. Thank goodness for this gap, right? Because there's a massive amount of computation happening under the hood, and you don't want to know it all. The conscious mind is meant to be like a newspaper headline. I mean, if you look at what's happening in America at this moment, there's a lot of stuff happening. There are factories running, there are cops chasing criminals, there are secretaries fielding phone calls, there are business deals being secured with handshakes, and so on. You don't want to know all that. You just want to know the headline. You pick up USA Today, and you just find out sort of the bottom line of what's going on. That's what you want the conscious mind to be doing, because it can't handle all of the detailed information. It doesn't want it. Another analogy for thinking about this is that the conscious mind is essentially like the CEO of the company. And what the CEO's job is, his job is to think about the long-term vision of the company, to do the long-term planning, and not worry about all the machinery that keeps the company running. If the CEO is messing around with people's software on their desk or in the cafeteria or in the mailroom, then the company's not operating correctly. The whole thing runs more slowly. And this is exactly what happens when the conscious mind tries to interfere in all of this automated stuff happening under the hood. If any of you play music, you know that if you start thinking about your fingers, you're dead, right? You can't do it when you're thinking about it. And this is a general principle that when the conscious mind tries to get down where it doesn't belong, everything gets messed up. So here's a neuroscience insider trick, which is if you're ever playing tennis and you're losing and you really want to win, there's always a nefarious way that you can win, which is you just compliment your opponent on his serve and you say, wow, you serve so well. How do you do it exactly? As soon as they start thinking about it, they're dead. They can't do it anymore. When I was younger, I played baseball, and our coach used to say, I want you guys to think out there. And I'd say, actually, you don't want us to think out there. You want us to train for a sufficient number of hours that we automatize these behaviors, and then we rely on our unconscious minds. He never bought it, so I had to write a book on it eventually. I want to give you an example of this. So everybody, put your hands up on your steering wheel. So put your hands up on your steering wheel in front of you, and I want you to make a lane change into your left lane. So you're driving 40 miles an hour, and you want to scoot one lane over to your left. Okay, go ahead, make your lane change. Okay, I didn't see anyone use their blinker, but that doesn't matter. Okay, you get extra points. Okay, as far as I could tell, every single person did it wrong. So everyone I saw banked their wheel over to the left and then banked to center. Okay, that would steer you off the road. You just went onto the sidewalk. The way to make a left lane change is you go to the left, back through the center, just as far to the right, and back to center again. That's what a lane change looks like. You do it every day, and you don't even know how you do it. This is an example of the type of thing that your brain knows how to do, and you don't even know what you're doing, right? So when we talk about our cognition, really, essentially all of it is happening incognito. It's happening under the hood. Okay. So to circle back around to the main point, we're made up of all this stuff, of molecules and neurons, and networks of neurons. Somehow, all this wet, biological, gushy stuff maps onto how we see the world and how we behave, our decisions, our hunches, our intuitions. And it's like an alien computational material. I mean, this is how I've come to think about the brain. It would be as though a spaceship crashed into the Earth, and we opened up this alien spaceship, and we found this weird pink, self-healing, miniaturized computational material that is unlike anything we've ever built or understand. And somehow that's us. When that changes, you change. And that simple fact leads us right into the heart of some very deep moral and ethical questions. So many of you are probably familiar with the story of Phineas Gage. For those of you who aren't, this was in the 1880s. He was a young man who was working on the railroads, and he would tamp down gunpowder with this iron tamping rod. And one day he was doing that, and the rod hit the rock, and there was a little spark, and it blew the gunpowder, and this iron tamping rod blew through his head, all the way through his head, and clattered to the ground 50 feet away. Now, the reason this became a very famous medical case is because he didn't die. In fact, he didn't even lose consciousness. And the first doctor to show up on the scene didn't even believe what had happened until Phineas Gage leaned over and coughed, and some brain fell out on the dirt. The reason it became a medical case on top of that he didn't die, is that his personality changed entirely. Just like that. And everyone who knew him said, Gage is no longer Gage. He's a different person now. He took to sleeping with prostitutes and cussing and gambling. He just became a completely different person after this iron tamping rod spirited away part of his frontal lobe. Okay, so this is when people started thinking, wow, you really depend on, who you are fundamentally depends on the integrity of this brain tissue there. That was 130 years ago. We've seen lots of examples since then. I'm sure some of you here remember Charles Whitman, who in 1966 climbed to the top of the tower in Austin, the UT Austin Tower, and he opened fire on people below, indiscriminately, strangers. He shot people, he shot the people who came to help them, he shot the ambulance drivers who came to help them. He just shot at people. He killed 31 and wounded 14 more until 4 deputies were able to get to the top of the tower and kill him. And when the police went to his house then after this bizarre incident, they found that he had the night before killed his wife and his mother. Now, the thing that was so strange on top of this completely shocking behavior was that there was nothing in Whitman's history that presaged this kind of event. I mean, he'd been an Eagle Scout. He'd been honorably discharged from the Marines. He worked as a bank teller. He was an engineering student at UT Austin. He was very high IQ. There was nothing about Whitman that should have led to this. But what happened is in his suicide note that he wrote the night before, he said, look, something inside of me has been changing over the past year. He'd in fact gone to a psychiatrist, but this was in 1966. There wasn't much that could be detected at that time. He said, something inside me is changing, and when this is all over, I want an autopsy to be performed. And that's exactly what happened. They opened up his skull, and what they found is that he had a brain tumor. And this brain tumor was pressing on a part of his brain called the amygdala, which was involved in fear and aggression. And we know that when your brain changes, so do you. Here's an example that just was in the medical literature recently. It was a 40-year-old man who had a normal sexual appetite. He started becoming a pedophile. He started collecting child pornography, soliciting young women, and then he made an inappropriate move on his prepubescent stepdaughter, and his wife had him arrested. The night before sentencing, he was having these worsening headaches. He went into the hospital finally. They did a scan. It turned out he had a massive frontal lobe tumor. He had a massive brain tumor. There was an emergency surgery. It was resected, and his behavior returned completely to normal. The story has an interesting postscript, because 6 months later, he started showing signs of pedophilia again. His wife took him back to the doctor. It turns out a part of the tumor had been missed. It was regrowing. The surgeons resected it a second time. His behavior returned completely to normal. So you are your brain, and of course, people universally administer alcohol, to change the chemicals in their brain to make themselves different. Drugs are used all the time. This is Chris Benoit, who is a Worldwide Wrestling Federation champion, who went home one night and killed his wife and his son and himself because he was on a steroid rage. Because his physician had conspired with him to give him massive doses of testosterone, and it changed his decision-making. And of course, some of you may know what's happening with Parkinson's medications. Some years ago, people noticed that these elderly people who were put on Parkinson's medications were suddenly becoming compulsive gamblers and blowing their family's fortune in Vegas. And it turns out that this medication works on a neurotransmitter system called dopamine, which is what goes wrong in Parkinson's, but it's also the same neurotransmitter system that's involved in risk-taking. So when you change what's going on in the brain, you change a person's decision-making. So nowadays, when we talk about morality and decision-making, what we're really talking about. Okay, well, this leads to a very deep question then, which is the one of free will. I mean, is the mind really separate from the brain? Or do these equal each other? And that leads to this very deep question about culpability. In what sense are we responsible for our actions if there's so much happening under the hood? Well, it turns out there's a very deep problem here, which is that the way we've constructed our legal system, it rests on two main assumptions. The first is that we are practical reasoners, meaning that we are free to choose how we act. We have free will that's built into the thinking of the system. And the second assumption is that all brains are created equal, which is to say, if you're over 18 and you have an IQ of over 70, then it's assumed that all brains have the same capacity for decision-making, for impulse control, for risk aversion, for simulating possible futures, and so on. And the problem is, that's a very charitable idea, but it's demonstrably false. Along any axis that you measure brains, you find that brains are extremely different from one another. Brains come about as a combination of genetics and environment that intertwine in extremely complex ways that take every brain off on a different developmental trajectory. So in the end, brains are like fingerprints. Everyone's got one, but they're different inside of every person. Okay, the problem is, because of these assumptions, there's this big tension between what we know in modern neuroscience and what the legal system, how it thinks about human behavior. And as a result, we treat incarceration as a one-size-fits-all solution. And many of you may know this, but many don't, which is that America leads the world in the percentage of our population behind bars. We incarcerate a higher percentage of our population than any country in the world. Okay, well, aside from being problematic in lots of ways, including if you want to talk about it being inhumane or not just or so on, it's not cost effective. I mean, it doesn't work, right? We've got this massive industry now for prison systems, but it's easily shown that prison is actually criminogenic. It leads people to come back to prison because you break their social circles and limit their employment opportunities and so on. The statistics now indicate that 30% of the incarcerated population has mental illness. What this means is that our prison systems have become our de facto mental health care systems, and it just doesn't make sense, and it's not cost effective. Some people worry that as we have a better biological explanation of human behavior, this will somehow let people off the hook. That's not what happens. You still have to take bad actors off of the street. But as we get a better understanding of brains and why people behave the way we do, we don't have to have a backward-looking retributive system where the emphasis is on how much do we punish you, but instead we have a forward-looking system where we say, look, we can do rational sentencing. We can base your sentence on your future dangerousness. We can have customized rehabilitation. When there are ways that we can help somebody and allow them to become a useful member of society again, we can leverage the tools of neuroscience to make that happen. And of course, we can have better incentive structuring. When people talk about deterrence and what things count as deterrence, it's always assumed that everyone responds to deterrence in the same way, and they don't. Brains are very different. There are different ways to reach different populations. There's a real need for understanding. This is from Whitman's suicide note that night. He said, if my life insurance policy is valid, please pay off my debts and donate the rest anonymously to a mental health foundation. Maybe research can prevent further tragedies of this type. This led me to start the Initiative on Neuroscience and Law several years ago. I've gone around the world speaking on these issues. There are several things that we address in the initiative, including how neuroscience can help us to have a rational drug policy, how new technologies will and won't improve issues like lie detection, how to improve the insanity defense, how to shape it correctly. Brain death is an area of neuro-legal consequence where you want to know, is the person actually alive in there? Is there somebody in there? And it turns out with new neuroimaging technologies, you can essentially ask that question now and find out if you should pull the plug or not. Of course, we address one of the worst technologies that's allowed in the courtroom, which is eyewitness testimony, because memory is a construction of the brain. And we also address the brain of the juror, which is the other half of the equation. It turns out we're very hardwired for retributivism. And so when we talk about improving the legal system, we have to understand essentially the impulses that we all come to the table with, and how, in some circumstances, it might make sense to override those. If anyone's interested in more on that, you can read our papers on newlaw.org. I just want to say one last thing, coming back to the original point about all the stuff that's happening under the hood. Sometimes people think about this as us not sort of being at the center of ourselves anymore, and that feels a little bit scary. And I think there's a historical analogy here, which is in 1610, when Galileo discovered the moons of Jupiter, he realized that when he looked out there, the cosmos was very different than what we had thought. It turns out we were not at the center of things anymore, but instead, the cosmos was something much more vast and wondrous than we had ever suspected. And that's exactly the story that we're finding when we look inside the brain. There's an upside to dethronements, right? Which is that when we're sailing inside the brain, what we're finding is whole universes that we never thought we would. And so the end result is that we have discovered the most wondrous and complex thing in the whole universe, and it is us. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David.
Yep.
All right, so before I hand you the MC responsibilities, as you so eloquently do each year for us, one quick question. You wrote an article in The Atlantic about why neuroscience matters in the development of a rational drug policy. Can you just expand on that for one quick minute?
Yeah, thanks. I threw a slide up there quickly, but the reason neuroscience matters for a rational drug policy is that currently the way we fight the war on drugs is by attacking the supply. And that's never going to work, because it's like a water balloon. If you press down on the drug supply in one place, it comes up somewhere else. If you want to have any meaningful thing happening there, you have to address the demand for drugs, and that is the brain of the addict. And we know so much now about the circuitry and pharmacology of drug addiction, and one of the things we're doing in my laboratory has to do with using real-time feedback in neuroimaging to help people overcome addiction. And I think that's the only path that's ever going to address the drug problem.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Dr.
very
David
much.
Eagleman. Thank you.